This is a story of formerly the greatest continent on the planet. A continent of innovation, culture and progress. A place of scientific breakthroughs, enlightenment and the birth of democracy. Now, however, these things have changed, and in this video I will tell you how the European story turned from one of growth and progress to one of decline. It is the story of a dying, aging, indebted system that is struggling to survive and is trying to make you pay for it. You see, all of the major governments in Europe have the same big problems. The first one is aging population. The European continent, just like every major developed region in the world, faces a total demographic collapse. Here is a map provided by the European Commission. In order to have the population stay the same, you need 2.1 births per woman. The idea is that two parents give birth to two children, and the 0.1 part accounts for some cases of child mortality. In 2022, the average birth rate in Europe was 1.46 children per woman, way below the replacement level. The scarier thing is that this is not only the average, but literally if you look at the map, there isn't a single country on the continent that is even close to 2. What does that mean? Well, less young people to pay taxes and work that have to support more and more older people who are retired and don't work or pay taxes anymore. Once you go into that downward spiral, there is no going back, because the older the population gets, the bigger the burden is on young people to support it, and that means they can afford to have less children, which makes the problem even worse, etc., etc. This is the percentage of GDP going to pension spending in different countries around the world. Notice how Italy, Portugal and France lead the pack, with Italy spending 16% of its GDP on pensions. And bear in mind, this is before the population ages further and the GDP goes down because of the lack of workers. The percentage is set to increase to 25% of the GDP in the UK in 2025. And how have the governments been dealing with that situation? One word: debt. The debt to GDP ratio of a lot of countries in Europe has been steadily rising and is reaching dangerous levels. Major economies like Italy, France and Spain have more than 100% debt to GDP, and the average for the EU gets closer and closer to the 100% mark. This is directly connected to the population decline. As more and more people are getting older without being replaced, more and more countries are desperate to replenish their tax base and are compensating with taking on debt. You can see in this chart the debt of both EU and the USA, with the EU being in blue, ballooning in the past 15 years. Well, let's see the chart of the fertility rate. This chart shows the long-term decline of European fertility. It fell below replacement level way back in the 70s and has never recovered. It made a bit of a rebound in the early 2000s and then started trending down again. Do you see the correlation here? The chart of the debt is going up at the same time as the chart of the fertility is going down. Because of the population decline and a lot of other factors like lack of innovation and over-regulation, in which we don't have time to get into this video, the European economic growth rate has been trending down for decades. How have the governments compensated for that? By taking on more debt. And this is likely to continue. According to the UN population forecast, this is how Europe's population will look like in the next century. So this will force governments to take on more and more debt. Now, why does this matter to you and how is it related to your pension? Well, the answer is that governments need to pay interest on the debt they take. And the lower it is, the lower their expenses are and the more debt they can take. Which means they will try to do everything in their power to make the interest rate on the debt be as low as possible. This explains the low, near 0% interest rates we have had for decades now that have distorted the economy and increased wealth inequality ever since the financial crisis. But apart from the central banks making the rate zero, one of the other primary ways governments artificially lower the interest on their debt is by having a lot of demand for it. The more buyers they have, the more they can afford to not offer high interest rates, because they don't need to compensate people for holding their debt as much as they otherwise would. Think about it this way. If no one wants to lend you money because they will only receive 2% per year from you, you increase the reward. You put it up to 3%. And if still no one wants it, you make it 4%, and so on until someone says, yes, okay, at 6%, I'll give you money. So the more buyers the governments have for their debt, the less reward they can give, hence the lower the expense for them. This is where the pension funds, banks and insurance companies come into the game. These entities are the biggest pools of capital in the economy. And so what the governments do is create regulations to force them to purchase government debt because it is the safest asset, and they justify it by saying that this way they are protecting the people. Well, it's interesting to me how they are protecting people by forcing them into an asset that continually performs worse than the official inflation rate, which we all know is understating the real inflation. And so this is why pension funds are forced to have a lot of government debt, or the so-called government bonds, in them, regardless of the fact that it devalues the savings of the population by making the fund lag behind inflation. Here is the construction of a popular pension fund in my country. Apologies for the fact that I have not been able to translate it, but it is a picture. Regardless, in Bulgarian, it basically says that the portfolio is 26% in stocks and 74% in bonds. And by the way, if you think these stocks are Microsoft or Nvidia, you are dead wrong. The majority of them are obscure local companies that I've never heard of, and that definitely should not have more weight in a portfolio than a company like Amazon or Coca-Cola. But I guess this is another regulatory framework forcing the pension funds to support local businesses. Going back to the asset allocation, it is ridiculous. Many of you might have heard of the 60-40 portfolio that is used by a lot of Americans, where there are 60% stocks and 40% bonds. I have made a video about it on my channel where I describe how it is absolutely insane to me to have 40% of your portfolio in bonds, and I back it up with data. However, here we have 3/4 of the portfolio in bonds, the majority of which are government bonds. Since bonds are fixed instruments that pay you very low fixed interest, the principal of the bond doesn't rise, unlike a good company's share price. Long-term bonds are getting destroyed by even a moderate inflation percentage of 2 or 3%. However, this is the entire game. This is why they do it. They force the pension funds to buy the government debt, which lowers the interest they have to pay on the debt, which allows them to take more debt. And they pay for it with your savings. This sneaky tactic is also part of a complex strategy called financial repression. You can read the definition of the term here, but basically what it does is that governments, through various methods, some of which I just explained, are able to suppress the interest rate savers get and indirectly borrow more money from the savings of society to pay off their debts. This is one of the main reasons I avoid, and I advise anyone I know to avoid investing in pension funds, government bonds, or keeping their money in the bank, and I buy real economically productive or scarce assets. Because when your savings are being channeled to the government through financial repression from your bank, where you get no interest, and from your pension fund, which underperforms inflation, you are getting poorer with time. However, you don't notice it, because when you log into your bank account, you see the same number. And when you check your pension fund, it says that it has been growing with, let's say, 3%. However, when 10 years have passed, you realize you are actually poorer. This is an insidious tactic because people measure their life in euros, and when they see the same or higher amount of euros, they don't have the psychological reaction of anger and loss. If every time you logged into your bank account, you saw your balance decline despite you not touching it, you will be furious. And when enough people are furious, governments are in trouble. However, by using financial repression, they don't need to directly take money from your bank account, but instead they use financial sorcery and they take your money either way, leaving you poorer and poorer without making you suddenly angry enough to go to the streets. Okay, if you're still watching and haven't been depressed enough, I'm here to tell you that there is hope. There are things you can do to change your future and avoid getting your retirement destroyed. However, they require a little bit of effort on your part so that you can start taking care of your savings on your own. Now, if you're employed, you can't stop investing in these pension funds completely. But what you can do is to get educated so that you can invest whatever money you have left in far better places instead of putting them in the voluntary pension funds. One way you can do that is by continuing to watch videos like this and increase your financial and investment education levels, which is what I did years ago. Frankly, I did it because there weren't any other options back then. If you want additional help with that and a faster, more structured way to do it, then I invite you to my Investing Masterclass, for which you can sign up from the link in the description. Either way you choose to go forward, I hope I was able to help you understand how you are getting robbed of your future. It's up to you now to stop it. I will see you again in my other videos or in the masterclass.